Thank you very much, Setani, and I too must thank the Social Science Research Council and all the organizers, and Jackie and the Dubai government, School of Government organizers as well, and I must apologize to you for because if it hadn't been for my relatively accidental involvement with this conference, despite Saturday's wonderful introduction, you might have had this time off. And because originally this was supposed to be given by Jomo Sundaram, who is a marvelous scholar and speaker. I've heard him several times. And then it was me and Craig. And now Craig is not here either. So anyway, I do have, but I will take up your time because I have a paper that I tried to cut, but I couldn't. And I'm also going to read it a little, but I'll show you some pictures. And also I should say that I did give a range of possible talks to give to Setani, but they chose the most historical of my talk, and maybe that is a necessary corrective, and I'm sure Tan Sen will be most appreciative of it, but others as well who have missed a greater historical dimension. And so the first thing about it is that it is chronologically organized, and the title, in case you missed it, is Visions of History, Trajectories of Power, China and India Since Decolonization. Somebody also said there wasn't enough China-India discussion. Well, you get it here now. Okay, let's see. I do have some pictures. Is anything showing up? Open. Okay, yeah, got it. Thank you. Okay, those are just maps and things, and I'll just get to... The vision of Chinese and Indian leaders of the mid-20th century, like Gandhi and Mao, were hardly limited to their nations alone. The epic proportions of their experimentation with social justice and their self-perception as inheritors of two great world civilizations ensured that they saw it as their destiny to transform not only themselves but the world. As the decolonization process unfolded after World War II, their bona fide anti-imperialist credentials presented an opportunity for these nations to offer an alternative to the colonial past. The chapters, this paper seeks to track the relationship between the two nation states as uneasy partners and rivals in the projection of their ideals and power in Asia. So the early period, ideals and problems. The transformation of decolonizing societies into nation states, a process that was rhetorically founded on the idealism of the anti-imperialist movement, actually generated inescapable tensions. The Westphalian system of nation state, with its ideal of self-regulating, competitive sovereign units, only partially reflected the range of relationships between states, even during the 20th century. Despite the theory of mutual respect, these states were engaged in a competition for resources and territory that entailed not only military conquest and colonization, but also annexation or domination of each other's territories. The hegemonic powers within the Westphalian system always aimed to modify the internal behavior of other states and communities, a distinctly un-Westphalian activity. Viewed from the outside, it seems that the Westphalian system had the unacknowledged function of restricting access to world resources differentially, particularly through colonial control. Not only were polities that were not part of or allowed into the system regarded as controlled colonial resources, but through both formal agreements and extra-treaty actions and violence, states established their political and economic dominance in the system. Resistance to hegemony by aspiring powers entailed considerable violation of the rules of the system, as in the well-known cases of Germany, Japan, and others. I have argued elsewhere that by the late 19th century, there developed an intrinsic relationship between imperialism and nationalism. In the competition for resources, Mobilizing the nation meant marshalling material and psychological resources for imperialist conquest, while imperialism abroad furthered nationalism and national power. This kind of competitive pressure often led to the breakdown of the international system, as during the two world wars. Thus, participation in a system of nation-states meant participating in a system that had historically been based upon the integration of imperialism and nationalism. How then could the new nation-states enter a competitive system without being imperialistic? One could argue that external competition was not necessary to the new iteration of the Westphalian system in the United Nations model. To some extent, this is undoubtedly true. China, following the Soviet Union, was avowedly built upon non-capitalist foundations, and the onset of the Cold War gave new nations such as India the ideas and space for autarkic development. Although capitalist economics may have been responsible for the institutionalization of competitive societies, the progressive vision of history that promised endless growth entailed competition, typically with other states, even among socialist societies, premised upon the rejection of capitalism. Growth entailed expansionism that was not only territorial and economic, but that had political and so easily incorporated within and marginalized by Nehru's vision of a modern industrial future for India. Economic development and the spread of social justice in India remained sluggish through the first 3 decades. How did the structure of a competitive nation-state system constrain the ideological choices available to these societies? What were the alternatives? For China, the goal of its leadership of the anti-imperialist movement was to produce revolutionary socialist societies among decolonizing nations. For India, the goal was to realize the Nehru-Gandhian ideals of peace, non-alignment, and constitutionalism. Finally got it out. And constitutionalism. From an outcome-blind 1950s perspective, India's nuclear program was almost as unexpected as China's turn to capitalism. The leaders of both states believed that their recent historical achievements, as well as their deeper historical greatness, entitled them to lead the new nations of the world along alternative paths. This post-colonial agenda is evident in Indian politics as early as 1947, with the first Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi, featuring a series of exhibitions revealing the greatness and influence of Indian culture, religion, and trade, extending from the Himalayas to Southeast Asia, Persia, and Central Asia. Indians were particularly proud of their historical influence in Southeast Asia. They imagined the perfection of Indian civilization in the past of this greater Sanskritic world, or even empire, one all the better for having been made not by power and wealth, but by ideas and values. The struggling KMT regime in China, you're talking about 1947, right, sent a delegation to the conference and was quick to match the Indian claims of greatness with still more extensive ones. The Chinese narrative of greatness derived from imperial China, not only having exerted a wide civilizing influence across much of Asia, but also having extended through the tribute system considerable political and economic power over these regions. To be sure, earlier Republican-era narratives of tributary sovereignty and heroic Chinese pioneers settling and civilizing Southeast Asian region were not foregrounded by the communists. Indeed, both the Indians and the Chinese quickly learned that these civilizing narratives could only be perceived by Southeast Asians as reproducing familiar patterns of imperialist behavior. However, during the early years of the PRC, since China's geopolitical influence was hampered in the east by Japan and in the north and west by the Soviet Union, its best chance to establish itself as a regional power, as Martin Stewart Fox points out, was in Southeast Asia. I would add that the Himalayan region also represented another, though lesser, geopolitical. Thus, both societies had what we might call civilizational narratives that justified the leadership of each to the decolonizing world. Between the late 1940s and the Bandung Conference of 1955, each state conducted a flurry of diplomatic exchanges and events to build the organizational bases to achieve these goals. The Government of India continued to hold conferences of Asian societies, whereas the PRC convened the World Federation of Trade Unions, an effort to bring trade unions across the world into a single international organization, not unlike the United Nations. They did so in Beijing as early as November 1949, so within a month of the victory. Burmese socialists also took the lead in organizing the Asian Socialist Conferences, which brought together Asian socialist parties and sought to more actively include Africa in the decolonizing movements, as well as create the basis for China's participation in the Bandung Conference. By the time of this landmark Bandung Conference, civilizational chauvinism was kept in check, and the leaders of the two nations unfolded their approaches and messages to the decolonizing world. As is well known, contrary to expectations, it was Zhou Enlai who succeeded in attaining the moral high ground at Bandung, while Nehru was unable to extricate the Indian side from arguments with the Pakistanis. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that only recently has India's status in Southeast Asia risen to any extent. From the end of the Bandung Conference, immersed in its problems with South Asia and the Himalayan region, India developed no coherent policy towards Southeast Asia, much less a sphere of influence, and declined in importance in that region. In part, the close relationship that developed between China and Pakistan succeeded in keeping Indian strategic concerns confined to South Asia for most of the post-independence period. At this juncture, it is necessary to explore the relationship between the two countries and temporarily bracket the comparative dimension. China became involved in the effort to engage Indian concerns within South Asia, and India found it difficult to exercise its hegemony even within that region. For over 30 years, India was unable to extricate itself or exercise sufficient leadership to break through this containment. Next section, territorial consolidation. The alternative civilizational goals towards which the leadership of India and China aspired to guide the new nations remained in uneasy tension with the tasks of nation and state building. The first of these tasks was the definition and consolidation of national territory. The PRC had the advantage of drawing upon a half-century of thinking on the question during the Republic and under the Kuomintang. The KMT, which after 1947 controlled a small part of Chinese territory, Taiwan, nonetheless claimed not only the entire territory of the Qing Empire, but regions that were part of the Qing and pre-Qing tributary system and beyond, including what they called the lost territories, which included huge swaths of Afghanistan, Iran, North India, and all kinds of things. These maps you have, KMT maps. The PRC tended to limit its claim to the extent of the Qing Empire. However, the Qing Empire was not a nation state, and there ensued the problem of what I have called incommensurable sovereignty. For decolonizing nations emerging from old empires such as the Qing or the British, the territorial problem was among the most enduring. Nationalists of the dominant ethnicity or group made claims upon regions or territories of the old empire, the principle of uti possidetis. But it was practically difficult for Indian and Chinese nationalists to extend or sustain the principle of nationality in several parts of the old empire. The peripheral regions of the Qing Empire, whether in Tibet, Mongolia, or Xinjiang, had multiple and flexible political affiliations, and their incorporation into the empire was often based on patronage of common religious or other cultural symbols rather than the modern conception of absolute belonging to a territorial nation. Similarly, the British Indian Empire incorporated regions and communities along lines of differentiation that enabled the Muslims of the empire to deny any obligation to the successor Indian state. The northern Himalayan states of Kashmir, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan remained nominally sovereign but were dependencies of the British government in India. Strategically, this vast region in Tibet served as a buffer for the British imperial government, which was focused on protecting India from other, especially Russian, imperial power. In other words, the principle of belonging to a national territory was incommensurate with the historical practice of loose affiliations and flexible incorporation into empire. Moreover, dominant nationalists were often making their claims on these regions precisely at a time when the elites of these regions or communities, such as the Mongols or the British Indian Muslims, were also developing a national consciousness. This was the basis, for instance, of the refusal by Muslims within the British Empire to join with the Republic of India, the Tibetan and Mongol refusal to participate in a Chinese nation, and so on. The contestation of acclaimed territories is also a reminder of the difficulty of separating or containing the differences between nationalism and imperialism. Between real independence for the periphery and its full incorporation, there were, of course, other modalities of dealing with the incommensurability problem, but they were often unsatisfactory. The Republic of India was forced to relinquish territories to Pakistan, seized much of Kashmir and several other princely states, and entered into treaties with Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim that essentially restored their status as buffer states the British had created to the north. In 1973, India incorporated Sikkim into the Indian Union. China too developed border differences with most of its contiguous states, but the most publicized and dramatic problem was, of course, the Tibetan one. The history of the Chinese incorporation of Tibet is a well-known one that I need not rehearse here. It is, however, instructive to follow how China sought to contain or limit the effects of its forceful integration of the periphery on its relations with its neighbors and sustain its anti-imperialist rhetoric. The doctrine used by the Chinese leadership to produce this effect was the doctrine of the 5 principles of coexistence, or Panchashila as it is known in India and in Indonesia. The 5 principles include mutual respect among nations, peaceful coexistence, equality, mutual non-aggression, and non-interference in the internal affairs of others. It originated in a treaty known as the Agreement between the Republic of India and the People's Republic of China on trade and intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India, signed in 1954. Later, Nehru would publicize it widely and make it both the core of New India's civilizational message in Bandung and the guiding philosophy of the non-aligned movement. As we know, it was also of great significance to the political philosophy of the Indonesian state. Panchashila was a kind of a Westphalian doctrine for the era of decolonization. The goal was to enable states to engage in relationships by setting aside troublesome or insoluble issues. In contrast to the Westphalian era, when most of the world was prey to the few nation states, this time around most of the world was dividing up into nation states, making the Panchashila doctrine seem comparatively fair. Nonetheless, it could still be used instrumentally to forcibly incorporate a contested region and declare it to be part of the national territory, as both China and India were to do. While India flaunted the rhetoric, the Chinese government utilized the 5 principles much more effectively. The clarity of the Chinese approach to the 5 principles emerged from its recent historical experience. Tongwang has shown that as the unequal treaties in China took center stage in the rise of Chinese nationalist consciousness, a school of legal practitioners, including such figures as Wellington Koo, W.W. Yen, Alfred Si, C.T. Wang, among others, emerged with a strong belief in the capacity of international law to rectify the inequality among sovereign states. We always think of Chinese at this point as being so revolutionary and uninterested in international relations, but they had a whole team that was doing a great deal. From the Republic through the Revolution, the KMT regime did succeed in gaining international recognition through legal processes. Of course, respect for international law was hardly seen as the only means to attain recognition and respect for the political values that China stood for. Communist revolution and nationalist resistance represented another means to achieve these international goals, and the Cultural Revolution represented their full ascendance, overwhelming law. But the 1950s was more circumspect, or to put it another way, if the World Maoist Revolution represented the civilizational goals of the PRC, Panchashila represented its state-building goals. and the Maoist regime utilized both instruments with considerable success until the Cultural Revolution. I believe that Panchashila is continuous with this conviction in the demonstrated value of law as a means of securing state sovereignty. In the view of the communists, pre-World War II international law was imperialistic and could not secure China's sovereignty. Panchashila was much better in that regard. It was anti-imperialist but gave the state full autonomy with its claimed sovereign territory, within its claimed sovereign territory. Thus, once the Chinese government obtained recognition by India of its claim to Tibet in the 1954 treaty, for which most Indians have not forgiven Nehru for conducting that treaty, it proceeded entirely on the supposition that China acted within Panchashila principles. At the same time, it could claim that India, by asserting rights over the Himalayan states, was engaging in hegemonism. In staking this high ground, the PRC regime ignored two historical realities. In India, Nehru, who appeared to determine foreign policy like Mao and Zhou in China, has been castigated for a lack of statecraft. From Sardar Patel, the Iron Man of India, whose tough-minded advice on China Nehru never took in the 50s, to Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh at the end of the century, critics of the early foreign policy of the Republic of India have seen it as overly influenced by unrealistic Gandhian notions of pacifism and idealism. The main charge has been that Nehru naively trusted the PRC leadership, beginning with his concession of China's central demand regarding the recognition of Tibet. Once this became a fait accompli, India had little basis on which to negotiate the border issues that became the cause of the flare-up in 1962. To be sure, the Indian leadership's inexperience with foreign policy matters played a role in Nehru's supposedly naive China policy. At the same time, however, bringing the PRC into the international arena dominated by the United States and the Western powers, by promoting China's cause in the United Nations, the Korean War, participation in Bandung and so forth, the period known in India as Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, brotherhood among Chinese and Indians, which then became Hindi Chini Bye Bye, goodbye, and now it's Hindi Chini Bye Bye, B-U-Y, right? So, was a crucial part, all this was a crucial part of Nehru's strategy for exercising leadership in the new bloc of decolonized nations. It is fairer to say that Nehru's strategy backfired. The Sino-India conflict of 1962 caused a reversal in Indian attitudes towards China and put Indian policy towards its neighbor firmly on a realpolitik track. The policy of militarily absorbing its small neighbors, Goa and Sikkim, helping bisect Pakistan through military intervention, intervening militarily in Sri Lanka in 1987, imposing economic sanctions that crippled Nepal when the latter tried to develop independent military ties with China in 1987, and conducting the nuclear tests in 1998 leave no doubt about India's much tougher attitude towards the South Asian area, which it sought forcibly to establish as its sphere of influence. From another angle, Indian realpolitik may be seen to represent its containment in South Asia. And one might even see India as mired in an area much smaller than the expansive domain envisioned by Nehru and other founders. Two factors need to be considered in the shrinking of India's Asian influence to South Asia. The first is a seeming failure to imagine a role in the wider region, especially after the disappointments of the non-aligned movement. India made no effort to join or any regional organization in East or Southeast Asia after Bandung. Even with respect to people of Indian origins in the region, and in marked contrast to the Chinese efforts to protect and woo overseas Chinese population in Southeast Asia, the government of the Republic of India was decidedly myopic in its view of ethnic Indians in the region. Sri Badruddin Tayyabji, a career diplomat, wrote, "I realized how superficial, how ill-informed, almost callous that view had been. and above all, how far we had failed in utilizing this enormous reservoir of Indian capital, men, money, skills, energy, and know-how overseas for building up the new India of our 5-year plans, our foreign policy, and our conception of international affairs. Indeed, the Indian